I think we can think about mental disability as part of course, we have this broad, again, view in terms of disability, because it includes, mental, physical, psychosocial, so across the board. That's how we, as the United Nations, we define disability. But in terms of disaster risk reduction, we are looking at the general population and its disabling impact of disaster itself. And then also we are looking at people with disabilities, across the board, again, mental, physical, and then, then all other invisible disabilities, which can be defined as mental, psychosocial, anything temporary, anything lasting, permanent. So people with disabilities and disabling impact of disaster on people with disabilities. So you're looking at both dimensions. So from the UN standpoint, we think about disabling impact of disaster risk reduction, which is more, I guess, in the realm of the work of United Nations, UNISDR, for example. But I think our work, how we look at it, is from more sort of a human side, which means that we look at the impact of disaster risk reduction on people with disabilities. But at the same time, we actually, when you look at people with disabilities, you don't want to just consider individuals with just victims of such disabling impact. We also look at them as a resource. We look at them as leaders. We look at them as agents of change that transform the community for more disaster prepared, in terms of disaster preparedness, in terms of bringing the whole community forward after disaster, in terms of post-reconstruction. So this is more or less how we look at the world of disability and disaster risk reduction. We have just two dimensions, but then our focus is more on individuals, especially individuals with disabilities. But then we look perhaps a slightly new, dimension. Most people know, but people with disabilities are very resilient, so they can be sometimes like leaders of the community. Maybe that perhaps dimension is new. In terms of preparedness, I think in terms of people with disabilities, disability itself as the issue, as a sort of a cross-cutting issue, and also as a disability lens. So there are three dimensions, let's say, when we talk about preparedness, because from disability standpoint. First, like per people-centered approach. The people-centered approach, as I just mentioned, people with disabilities can be a resource. Because we have already good practical experience, like in what happened in Sendai. There were psychosocial people with psychosocial disabilities were trained to follow, again, this disaster, like tsunami, for example, in Rikuzen Takada City, for example. And there were many examples of how they really saved the community people, how they saved their families, because once they are trained, they actually just follow exactly with the training. And there's this excellent, everyone was saved of those people with disabilities who are around them once the tsunami hit, because they dragged people, say, we have to go, and then they went out and just said, the tsunami is coming, let's go. So they were very persistent, and then they all evacuated. So that's more like personal, like a good practice. So people-centered story of what it means for people with disabilities to be an integral part of disaster preparedness. And the second dimension is the disability perspective. It's more like an analytical lens. Second dimension of this, is, and as I said, just to use this analytical lens, we can look at the population and preparedness from the perspective of how disability can impact on the population, and how then disaster preparedness need to be adjusted or to be planned for the community or for individuals or for particular district, because we have aging population in Japan, for example. So this actually would include huge percentage of population. So when you talk about disaster risk preparedness, I think then you talk about almost like 30%, or, including persons with disabilities, elderly, and then those who are temporarily impaired, like for any reasons. It could be pregnancy, it could be any other reasons. So you would actually prepare for much more bigger number of population than now. And then and also requirement for such preparedness takes very specific measures. So I think from the standpoint of disability perspective, using it as an analytical lens, I think it gives much better protection for much bigger population. And the third dimension is actually more to do with how post-reconstruction, what the role of, again, going back to human-centered approach, post-reconstruction, once, unfortunately, the city, for example, Takara city has been destroyed totally in Japan. But we have actually learned from the city government and also those who worked in Takara city that they are now going to prepare for accessible city. They're going to make the city more improved. They actually look into more social inclusion, both in physical context, but also not only in physical context, but also in a context of a community activity, community living, and community networks. So I think they want to be more connected, they want to be inclusive, they want to be accessible, and also sustainability, because they want to sustain the city to be inclusive, to be accessible, to be able to be resilient. So I think in that context, people with disabilities play, from again human-centered approach, a huge role, because if people with disabilities can have access to everything. They can be included. They can actually build their own network. They can actually be an integral part of the community. They can participate in economic, social life of the community. And then it's most likely that if it's accessible for people with disabilities, older persons, it's easier for them. For one pregnant woman, it's easier to move around. So you are transforming society from that of limited accessibility, rather not very much inclusive society, but it makes it, I think, easier for the whole community to transform itself. So that, I think, the third dimension, this people-centered approach from the standpoint of persons with disabilities, I think it could make a huge difference, in terms of how society can learn from what happened, but it would actually prepare itself for a better future. I think how they can include is, it's again the same principle of people-centered approach from the standpoint of persons with mental disabilities in this context, and they should be part of all planning stages. So, in terms of involving, making sure that there is somebody with mental disabilities, experience with mental or psychosocial disabilities, will always be at the table when they discuss such measures. Also, implementation stage, we should include group of people with mental disabilities, as part of that. Or again, not just physical participation, but I think it's important to also involve experts and also involve the families, and also involve not just persons with mental disabilities or psychosocial disabilities themselves, but also those have experience of working with them, so in a different capacity. So you would have, in fact, those who are touched by the mental and psychosocial disability, along with those with, because at the United Nations, where we have observed during the process of, for example, drafting of International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, I have personally observed over the past, that took about 7 years. So that 7 years, I observed that people with disabilities themselves and member states themselves realize that they cannot do, they cannot achieve the goal of social inclusion or disability inclusive development themselves. They have to work together with experts. They have to work together with those who can complement what they can give, what their expertise, their experience. So I think in this sense, this kind of, well, we use the term like multi-stakeholder partnership, but what it is that you include the persons with disabilities, mental disability in this case, in your question, and involving those who can actually complement their contributions. So I think that's what's important. But in obstacles for such measures, I think there are a number of obstacles. We have, this morning we had an expert meeting, the first session, where we talked about how stigmatization, discrimination, ignorance about mental disability, psychosocial disabilities, the keep people from understanding the importance of inclusion of people with mental and psychosocial disabilities. We also talked about as obstacles, again, the lack of systematic process of consultation. You have consultation with people with disabilities, you have always people with physical disabilities, but you don't have participation of those with invisible disabilities. And I think that invisibility should be, again, recognized, just like the international community recognized that disability has been invisible in development. How can this be? Because they are such a huge percentage of the world population. It's almost more than 15%. You're talking about a huge number of people. We are missing their contribution. We are excluding them. So I think from the standpoint, this invisibility issue is a huge obstacle. And non-recognition, we have yet to recognize this invisibility and do something about it. It hasn't taken place. So I think that those two are major obstacles at this time for including mental and psychosocial people with mental and psychosocial disabilities to be part of the measures that you mentioned. What I have learned from our partners, our stakeholders, at UN or Japanese leaders, like Japan Disability Forum has many disability leaders, and we also have experts who have been working with us on issues concerning mental and psychosocial well-being and disability and development. We have many of the experts. What I can sum up, after having discussed with them during the past 3 years, is that people with disabilities, mental disabilities, have proven to be a resource for disaster preparedness and disaster, again, post-reconstruction period. During the past 3 years, they have actually done evidence-based studies as to what happened in different communities. But we have this particular examples in Rikuzen Takara City and different small communities near Rikuzen Takara City, as I already mentioned, that the children with psychosocial disabilities and people with mental disabilities became the resource to save lives in the community. So in that context, I think there have been more studies or more, again, understanding that's been, again, deepened based on what happened. So I think, like tomorrow there'll be more discussion on this. So I don't really need to, perhaps, to elaborate on some of the examples, because there'll be more new examples and new, I think, perhaps analysis of what happened. But I think we will see, forum like tomorrow, that we actually need to really see how best we can understand people with these mental disabilities as a resource for our community. So that's maybe I'll go back to the very first point. So we want to actually help the community to understand, to promote this understanding from Japan, also to to the third global conference in Sendai, which is our UN conference, and then to the world. And then we will be also using all the resource that will be put together at the third global conference in Sendai as an integral part of the post-2015 development framework, which is going to be the framework, big framework for a global development agenda. So that is something that I guess would be considered as a contribution of Japan, and I think it will be I guess what we already discussed as post-reconstruction process, which would help both Japan and also and other countries and also the international community, the understanding of mental well-being and the understanding of disability, understanding of disaster risk reduction, and how we can use this post-reconstruction period as a starting point, as a resilience building period. So that we would always remember our UN. We're starting, by the way, UN campaign for disability inclusive disaster risk reduction, and our motto will be inclusion saves lives. So I think this will be in a period for us to look at again, this basic point, inclusion saves lives, and I just wanted to share with you that this campaign that will start with United Nations public information next week on International Day of Disabled Persons will be able to impact from the world, but starting with Japanese contribution, but then we would include all the contributions made by people with mental and including also accentuating the contributions made by people with mental and psychosocial disabilities. Well, that's precisely what we were discussing right before I came here, namely to discuss targets and indicators of again, disability inclusion in disaster risk reduction targets and indicators, which would be an integral part, which will be part of a post-2015 development goals and targets and indicators. So this is a technical exercise, but I think it's a very important exercise that should be more, again, should be understood by much bigger number of people, because precisely because of what you were saying, because by, again, we use a term like disaggregation or inclusion, but what it is like, I think if we can start scientifically, for scientific evidence of collecting data, statistics, and also doing analysis on the situation of people with mental disabilities and how, again, their situation in the context of promoting disaster risk resilience and post-reconstruction, including that dimension. If we can have maybe specific indicators in a national level, global level, I think that would definitely be, that would actually help many countries. And of course, Japan can already contribute to, with its data and statistics. But I think that will be one systematic way to continue monitoring and evaluating of progress, which hopefully will have been made for including the perspective of persons with mental and psychosocial disabilities, as well as participation of people with mental and psychosocial disabilities in the context of future disaster risk reduction policies and programs and their implementation